Okay, welcome everybody to Chapter 22. We're going to be talking about the cardiovascular system, specifically the heart, which is the pump that drives the blood through the vasculature. Where is the heart, first of all? Well, it's behind the sternum in the mediastinum of the thoracic cavity, and it's enclosed by the bony thorax. This is between the two lungs. Two-thirds of it lie to the left of midline. It's surrounded by the pericardium, which is a fluid-filled sac that lubricates the heart as it beats. The fibrous pericardium is inelastic and it anchors the heart in place. Inside it is the serous pericardium, which is a double layer around the heart. The parietal layer is fused to the fibrous pericardium. That's the layer of the pericardial sac that's closest to the cavity inside which the heart sits. Well, the intervisceral layer is the part that adheres directly to the heart muscle. So you have to think of this as a fluid-filled hollow sac that surrounds the heart. The fluid that fills it is called pericardial fluid, and it reduces friction during the heartbeat, which is something that's going to occur throughout your life. And here is the location of the heart. You can see here the bony thorax cut away so that you can see now the location of the heart. Remember, for the purposes of this diagram, this is the right side, this is the left side. So the heart sits approximately in the center of your chest, with the bulk of it lying now to the left of the sternum. These are the lungs. Notice that the left lung has a notch to compensate the space of the heart. This is called the cardiac notch. And as a result, the left lung has a little bit less respiratory capacity than the right lung because of this anatomical difference. Now, in some people, very few people in the population, there's a condition called situs inversus, in which the heart actually tilts in the other direction. This doesn't have really any effect on the quality of life for these individuals, but it is an anatomical variation that we want to be aware of. Now, the nice thing about the heart is that it does lie inside the bony thorax. This is one of the protective aspects of the skeletal system. Remember, I told you that in addition to providing support and the ability to move, the skeletal system also protects a lot of our vital organs, and this is one of the vital organs protected in this case by the bony thorax. We lie behind the sternum and inside the rib cage, and as a result, injury to the heart as a result of impact is much more difficult than if it were to, say, lie in the abdominal pelvic cavity. The other thing I want you to notice about the location of the heart is its proximity to the lungs, and specifically this is a portion of the respiratory system known as the respiratory division of the respiratory system. There's two divisions, the conducting and the respiratory division, and this proximity of the lungs to the heart makes it very easy for blood to flow from the heart to the lungs and back again with very little resistance, and this facilitates the exchange of oxygen for CO2. If the lungs were distant from the heart, it would be much more difficult to oxygenate the blood and pump it around the body. So this is a fortunate coincidence. Notice that there are also some great vessels leaving the heart. You can see a few of them here. This is the aortic arch. This is the great vessel that leads oxygenated blood out of the heart to the rest of the body. And behind it, kind of in this diagram, if you look very carefully, you can see here the pulmonary arteries. You can see the one leading to each lung. The pulmonary trunk is shown here. That's the great vessel that leads from the right side of the heart to the lungs. And I believe you can see here the superior and the inferior vena cava, which is sort of obscured by the heart in this diagram, and that is how deoxygenated blood makes it back to the heart after it has made a trip around the body. So the job of the heart, as we're going to find out, is to move blood around the body from the lungs to the heart and from the heart to the rest of the system. The circulatory portion that is from the heart to the rest of the body is called the systemic circulation, and the circulation between the lungs and the heart is called the pulmonary circulation. And here you can see a transverse section through the thoracic cavity showing you the location of the heart. See that it's posterior to the sternum. This is posterior in this diagram. This is anterior. Note the lungs on either side. You can also pick up here the aorta. There's the heart proper. This is the pericardial cavity, and the pericardial sac occupies that. There is the esophagus, and in front of the esophagus is the trachea. The sixth thoracic vertebra is what's shown here. There is the spinal cord. There's the spinous process of the vertebra. So, well protected is the heart. Okay, the epicardium is the outer layer of the heart wall. The myocardium is the cardiac muscle proper. There are two separate networks that are connected through gap junctions and intercalated discs. These are the atrial and the ventricular networks. These contract as a unit. The endocardium is made up of squamous epithelium, and it lines the inside of the myocardium. So if we look here, you can see these tissue layers. What we've done is we've taken a coronal section through the heart. I want you to notice a few things here. Notice that the myocardium in the left ventricle is extremely thick, and the reason for this is that it does more work than any other chamber of the heart because it has to pump blood throughout the entire body. And look how substantial it is compared to the walls of the right ventricle shown here. This is the tricuspid valve. This is the bicuspid valve. This is the pulmonary semilunar valve, and that right there is the aortic semilunar valve. There is the right atrium, right ventricle, left atrium, left ventricle. Now if we cut through this section here and we look at the wall of the heart, you can see here the fibrous pericardium, and this is the parietal layer of the pericardium, the part that's very close to the heart muscle itself. This area here, this dark line here, that's the pericardial cavity, which is filled with the pericardial fluid, and this is the visceral layer of the pericardium. Okay, so you can see here the parietal layer and the visceral layer. Notice the visceral layer is closest to the heart muscle. The parietal layer is furthest from the heart muscle. The myocardium is this layer of cardiac muscle shown here, this extremely thick layer, and then here you can see the endocardium rather, made up of squamous epithelia. So you got different tissue types here. You've got essentially an epithelial layer, a muscular layer, another epithelial layer, a fluid layer, and then another epithelial layer. So if we look at the heart muscle itself and we look at the junctions that connect the cardiomyocytes to each other, what you can see are these intercalated discs. Remember that heart muscle tissue has one nucleus per cell, and the cells are extremely branched. But we have two types of junctions. We have gap junctions inside these intercalated discs, and we also have a series of desmosomes, and this serves two purposes. This keeps the heart capable of electrical communication from cell to cell, but it also keeps the heart muscle cells from coming apart when the heart contracts. And so this does two things. This allows the electrical signals to be propagated rapidly through the cardiomyocytes from cell to cell as a result of direct connections. That's what these gap junctions do. You can see them here. Okay, you can pick them up if you look in any of the intercalated discs. But it also allows structural integrity for the heart so that when it contracts, the heart muscle doesn't actually become unstable and fly apart. So here you can see the cardiac muscle fiber. That's the cell itself. There's the nucleus of the cardiomyocyte. Look at all the mitochondria that are in there. Now, if you think for a moment, you can probably figure out why so many mitochondria are needed in cardiomyocytes, and the reason is we require lots of ATP in order to feed the energy debt that the heart produces as a result of constantly contracting and relaxing. Heart has four chambers. The two upper chambers are the atria. Between them is the inner atrial septum, and this contains the fossa ovalis, which is a remnant of the foramen ovale. And then there's two lower chambers. These are the ventricles, and between them is an interventricular septum. And this is important because what we want to do as the blood flows through the heart is ensure one direction of flow. We don't want the blood to flow back in the direction from which it came. So we have a series of one-way valves and a series of septa that guarantee that the blood that moves through the heart moves from chamber to chamber and moves in a unidirectional fashion. The wall thickness depends on the workload, and as a result, the atria have the thinnest walls. The right ventricle is a little bit thicker than the atrial walls, but the left ventricle has by far the thickest wall of the heart. Now, what you're looking at here is an anterior view of the heart, and we can see a couple of very interesting features here. Again, we've already pointed out the aorta and the pulmonary trunk and the right and left pulmonary arteries. There's the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay, this is a branch of the left coronary artery, and this area here is essentially homologous to the ventricular septum. So what you're looking at here with this branch of the coronary artery is this, it's like a sulcus on the surface of the heart that's filled with, you can see there's fat lining it, and this is where the wall between the two ventricles would lie. This is the right coronary artery. This is the left coronary artery. These are the auricles. This is the left auricle. This is the right auricle. There's the descending aorta. This is the back end of this great vessel as it whips up and around and it drops down behind the heart, comes down here. This is the ligamentum arteriosum, and it's kind of an interesting structure. It's what's left over from the fetal circulation once the vessel that connects the aorta to the pulmonary trunk collapses. This was at one time basically a vessel that would connect these two great vessels together, because remember, in the fetal circulation we don't use the respiratory system, and as a result we are unable to get oxygen to all the different tissues of the body unless we use a bypass that connects the right and the left circulatory systems. And the oxygenated blood in this case is actually coming as a result of the embryonic blood scavenging oxygen from the maternal circulation and supplying it to the embryo as it grows inside the uterus of the mother. So, interesting little leftover from when we were in utero there, that little ligament. Now, in some individuals, this vessel persists, and so what this is a patent fetal structure that can result in inefficiency in circulation. It can be surgically corrected so that we don't have to mix oxygenated with deoxygenated blood in the adult. There are other modifications that we'll talk about in the fetal circulation a little bit later on in the chapter. I think we've touched on everything I want to talk about here. The pericardial sac in this view has been cut away so that you can see the myocardium directly, and it's easier to see the great vessels. Now, if we look at the back of the heart, and we see the left atrium here, here are the left and the right pulmonary veins. This is the descending aorta. Here you can see the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery, the superior and inferior vena cava, and this is the right atrium right here. Okay, there's the left ventricle. This is the coronary sinus. Notice that it's filled with deoxygenated blood, and you can see also the ascending aorta. Remember, we're looking at the back of the heart here. Okay, so interesting view, front and back. This is just another view. We've seen this already. This is a coronal section through the heart, and again, you can see a lot more of the internal structures here. Right atria, right ventricle. This is the tricuspid valve. These are the papillary muscles. Okay, these little finger-like projections here. These are the chordae tendineae that attach to them, one to each flap of the tricuspid valve. And you might ask, well, what do they do? Essentially what they do is they pull the flaps open while the atria squeeze, and this aids in the passage of blood from the upper to the lower chamber. So you've got a set of these papillary muscles here and here in the bottom of each ventricle, and you've got chordae tendineae in each of these chambers as well. You can also see the superior and inferior vena cava. Again, the pulmonary semilunar valve, the aortic semilunar valve, the left atria, the left ventricle, again, note the thickness of the wall, and the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, the pulmonary veins, and the pulmonary arteries. Okay, you can see there as well. Okay, so let's talk about the great vessels. On the right side of the heart, we're dealing with blood returning to the heart from the body. It is nutrient poor and oxygen poor as well. The superior inferior vena cava deliver deoxygenated blood to the right atrium from the rest of the body. The coronary sinus drains the heart muscle veins. The right atrium, when it squeezes, sends blood to the right ventricle through the tricuspid valve. The right ventricle will then squeeze and pump blood through the pulmonary trunk to the right and left pulmonary arteries, which will then head to the lungs. Now, what happens in the lungs, you might ask? Well, what happens in the lungs is that the oxygen picks up, or the blood picks up oxygen, and it unloads CO2, and as a result, it changes color from a dark red, almost bluish color, as you see them in the veins of the systemic circulation, to a bright red color, indicating that the hemoglobin has bound the oxygen. Now, as we come back to the heart, the pulmonary veins drain oxygenated blood from the lungs. We then move to the left atrium. The left atrium will then squeeze, sending blood through the bicuspid valve into the left ventricle, which will then squeeze, sending blood through the aortic semilunar valve to the rest of the body. Between the pulmonary trunk and the aortic arch is the ligamentum arteriosum, which is a remnant of the ductus arteriosum in the fetal circulation. And again, the reason for this structure is in utero, in the fetal circulation, we have no use of the lungs. The respiratory system is not functional. As a result, in order to get blood to both the oxygenated blood to both the systemic circulation and the pulmonary circulation, we need a series of bypasses in order to oxygenate both the lung tissue and the systemic tissue. And the ductus arteriosus is one of the ways that that's done. This is the same view of the back of the heart that we saw earlier, so there's nothing really new to note here. The ligamentum arteriosum is not visible in this view. It's only visible anteriorly. And again, this is the coronal section through the heart, again showing you the relevant internal valves and great vessels. So let's talk about the valves. They're designed to prevent backflow in response to pressure changes of the blood in the heart. The atrioventricular valves lie between the atria and the ventricles. The right atrioventricular valve is the tricuspid valve, and it's named the tricuspid valve because of the presence of three cusps. Well, what in the heck is a cusp? A cusp is a flap, and these flaps are connected by chordae tendineae to the papillary muscles at the base of each of the two ventricles. The left atrioventricular valve is the bicuspid or mitral valve. The reason it's called the bicuspid valve is because of, instead of having three flaps, the bicuspid has two flaps. It's called the mitral valve because these flaps, when they are opened, resemble a bishop's mitre, with that funny pointed hat that a bishop or a pope wears. So it has two different names. Now, in the event that these valves weaken and are unable to do their job properly, and as a result there's backflow of blood, this is called a prolapse. A prolapse can happen for a lot of different reasons. You can get calcification on the valves, you can get weakness in the valves, or you can have chordae tendineae that become slack or even snap. And the result is an inefficient pumping of oxygenated blood to the body. And so you experience a low energy level and an inability to exert yourself for extended periods. This can be repaired surgically. Sometimes it's optional, sometimes it's absolutely necessary, depending on the severity of the defect. The semilunar valves are near the origin of the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, and these are one-way valves that ensure that the discharging chambers will only pump blood out of the ventricles and either to the lungs in the case of the right ventricle, or to the aorta and subsequently to the body in the case of the left ventricle. And you can have prolapses in any of these four valves. The aortic and pulmonary valves are their designations. Now, here we can see some of these valves. There's the bicuspid valve opening. Again, remember that this is the left atrioventricular valve. Notice when it's open, when the chordae tendineae are pulled on by the papillary muscles, we allow blood flow, provided couple things. I mean, gravity helps, but certainly the squeezing of the atria assists in the movement of blood through this one-way valve. And once now the blood is completely emptied from the atria to the ventricles, once the ventricles begin to squeeze, what happens is this valve will shut and won't allow blood to flow back in the opposite direction, as you can see here, right? As the ventricles are squeezing, two things are happening. The atrioventricular valves are shutting, and at the same time, the semilunar valves are beginning to open up. Now, these valves will only open if the pressure in one chamber is greater than the pressure in another chamber or in a great vessel. So you have to produce sufficient force in order to get those valves open in the first place. But in the event that these valves were weak or didn't work, you can see what would happen is when the ventricles would squeeze in this case, there'd be backflow of blood into a previous chamber. Now, one of the ways this is detected is using a stethoscope, and what you hear is a whooshing sound or a gurgling sound that you wouldn't expect to hear in between the lub dubbing of the heart. So this is one of the things a doctor listens for when you have a routine physical examination. So if we look at the great vessels from the top, specifically the valves, what you're seeing here, here's posterior, here's anterior, okay, and you can see here the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves closed, and here you can see the bicuspid and tricuspid valves open. All right, so what does this mean? In this case, what we've done is we've removed the upper chambers, so all you see are these valves. And at this time, what's happening is that both atria would be squeezing and forcing blood from the upper chambers into the lower chambers. The ventricles have yet to squeeze. That will come next. When the ventricles squeeze, what will happen is the aortic and pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves will open and blood will flow out of the discharging chambers to the lungs in the case of the right ventricle and to the aorta in the case of the left ventricle. And again, you can have prolapses in any of these vessels. This is just a look at how the blood actually flows through the body. So what you're seeing here is a diagram. So let's start with deoxygenated blood coming back to the body. So what we experience here is that the pulmonary trunk and the, let's see, blah, 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 blah. I want to go to, here we go. Let's start down here. Here's number one. So deoxygenated blood flows back to the right atrium through the superior and inferior vena cava as it's collected from the tissues of the body. It's been exhausted of its oxygen. It's also been exhausted of a lot of its nutrients, and it contains a lot of waste products. As the right atria collects this deoxygenated blood, it then will increase in pressure, and then at a specific time, designated by the pacemaking tissue inside the heart, the atria will squeeze, the tricuspid valve will open, the right ventricle will then receive the deoxygenated blood. And then as the right ventricle begins to squeeze, the tricuspid valve will shut. This will prevent backflow from the right ventricle to the right atrium and will at the same time send the deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary valve. Through the pulmonary valve, it will flow into the pulmonary trunk to the pulmonary arteries, and from the pulmonary arteries, it'll head to the lungs. Now, one thing I want you to note here, notice that the arteries in the pulmonary circulation contain deoxygenated blood, while the veins, as we're going to see in a minute, contain oxygenated blood. So one of the most important things to understand about circulation is that the term artery and vein has nothing to do with the state of the oxygenation of the blood that's in it, i.e. the color of the blood. It has to do with the direction of the blood either away from or towards the heart. Remember, always remember, that arteries carry blood away from the heart and veins carry blood back to the heart. Now, In the pulmonary circulation, the arteries carry deoxygenated blood and the veins carry oxygenated blood. In the systemic circulation, the veins carry deoxygenated blood and the arteries carry oxygenated blood. Now, what happens once we hit the lungs? Well, if we're breathing oxygen-rich air, what will happen is that the oxygen will flow into the blood as a result of the difference in concentration gradient of oxygen between the blood that's coming to the lungs from the heart and the oxygen in the air. As the oxygen binds to the hemoglobin in the blood will change color. Then the oxygenated blood will be drained by the pulmonary veins back to the left atrium. The left atrium will then squeeze, sending blood through the bicuspid valve to the left ventricle. Then the left ventricle will squeeze, the bicuspid valve will shut. The aortic semilunar valve will open and blood will enter the aorta, and from there will be sent to the rest of the body. So blood flow through the vessels into the myocardium is the coronary circulation. And you can think of the coronary circulation as actually part of the systemic circulation. The heart muscle is part of the body's tissues. And so one of the things that occurs when that left ventricle squeezes is that we supply the heart muscle as well. The left and right coronary arteries branch off of the aorta and they carry blood throughout the cardiac muscle. The oxygenated blood is collected by the coronary sinus, which is on the posterior side of the heart, and empties into the right atrium. So it's nice for the heart because the heart is getting first dibs on the blood supply. 1% of cardiac muscle generate action potentials, and these are the pacemaker and conduction systems that are embedded in the walls of the heart. The heart muscle tissue itself has a capacity to beat all by its lonesome in the presence of proper temperature, proper fluid content, proper electrolyte content, and proper amounts of organic fuel. But a cardiomyocyte won't necessarily beat in the same rhythm as another cardiomyocyte. The only way that we get these cardiomyocytes, these heart muscle cells, to beat together as a unit is to generate a signal which can spread in a uniform fashion across the atrial walls, across the ventricular walls, and then be regenerated periodically. And this allows the entire heart muscle to beat as a unit instead of just vibrating and not effectively moving blood throughout the body. So this pacemaker and conduction system begins at the sinoatrial node, which is nicknamed the pacemaker of the heart. Once the sinoatrial node generates an electrical signal, the atria will contract. Okay, so the right and the left atria will contract at the same time. The AV node will then intercept the signal, and the AV node sits at the top of the atrioventricular junction at the superior tip of the ventricular septum. Okay, so you can visualize about where that is, about where the four chambers would almost touch if there were not septa between them. The AV node will slow the signal down periodically, momentarily, and the reason for this is to give time for the atria to contract and for the ventricles to fill with blood. So we're waiting now for the discharging chambers to completely fill up. At that point, what will happen is that the AV node will propagate the signal down the AV bundle. These are bundle branches. There is a right and a left bundle branch. It'll head down to the apex of the heart, which, remember, is inferior to the base of the heart. And then this signal will radiate up the Purkinje fibers, from which we go to the apex to the base, after which the ventricles will contract, sending blood to the heart in the case of the right ventricle, or to the lungs in the case of the right ventricle, and to the rest of the body in the case of the left ventricle. This pacemaker depolarizes spontaneously, so it's an unstable situation for the cell. The sinoatrial node depolarizes about 100 times per minute. the AV node about 40 to 60 times per minute, and in the ventricle about 20 to 35 times per minute. The fastest one will run the heart, so this is termed the pacemaker, and this is the SA node generally. Now, one of the things that you probably realize is that the heart will change its rate to suit our activity levels. And you might think, well, gee, if the sinoatrial node is the boss of the heart, it must be the one that is controlling the heart rate independently of anything else. And that's not entirely correct. Basically, the way we gauge the heart rate to match our activity level is through input coming from the autonomic nervous system. The two divisions that control heart rate are the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system generally causes the firing of the SA node to increase, whereas the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system causes the firing of the SA node to decrease. And so this is our speed governor on the heart. Now, if we look here at an EKG, what you're seeing is a method whereby we can gauge the electrical activity of the heart depending on the magnitude, the direction, and the speed of the electrical signal as it moves down the atria, down the atrioventricular septum, down the ventricular septum to the apex, then back up the ventricular walls to the atrioventricular boundary, and then the whole thing starts over again. So if you look here, you're breaking this electrocardiogram up into a characteristic series of waveforms. This is a graph paper that is fed inside an instrument, and you have a needle that will actually make these tracings as the electrical signal in the heart propagates through it. So imagine a little ballpoint pen writing on this paper as the paper rolls by it in this direction. The P wave is the first wave that you detect, and the P wave is an indicator of atrial depolarization. What happens when the P wave is over is that the atria will have contracted, and the next complex you see is the QRS complex. Now, the QRS complex represents the movement of the electrical signal from the AV node down the bundle branches and then slowly up the Purkinje fibers. The T wave represents atrial repolarization, and at that point we're able now to start all over again with a new contraction. You can see here atrial contraction occupies now what's indicated by the blue bar up here, and ventricular contraction is indicated by the yellow bar shown here. So to make a long story short, ventricular contraction begins with the onset of the QRS complex. It ends at the apex of the T wave. Atrial contraction begins with the apex of the P wave and ends with the beginning of the QRS complex. And I've got a graphic that I'll run after the next slide that'll show you how to relate the beating of the heart with the events that occur on the electrocardiogram. And it's a nice little way to see each of these things occurring and know where the signal is going and the magnitude and the rate and the direction that the signal is taking in the heart. And this will tell you a little bit about why these waveforms have the shape that they do. So the electrocardiogram is a recording of the currents that are generated inside the heart. It can be termed an EKG or an ECG. That's the two words for the same thing. The K actually comes from the German cardiogram, whereas in English we use a C for cardiogram. The P wave represents atrial depolarization. Contraction begins right after the peak of the P wave. Repolarization is masked in the QRS complex. That's why you don't see it. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization and contraction of the ventricles, and then the T wave represents ventricular repolarization. So those are the events and the order in which they occur. So this happens just after the ventricles relax. So here you can see a little diagram showing you the SA node, the AV node, the bundle branches. This is the left bundle branch, this is the right bundle branch. The Purkinje fibers are these fibers radiating up the walls. Okay, so signal goes from here to here, rapidly down here, and then radiates up the walls of the heart. Again, right ventricle, right and left atrium. Now, obviously, if we have a problem with the conduction system, we're going to have a problem with the heartbeat. The sinoatrial node is the initiator of the heartbeat. It receives suggestions from the autonomic nervous system as to the rate with which it should depolarize. The atrioventricular node is the next piece of conductive material to receive the electrical information from the SA node, at which point what happens is that the atrioventricular bundle will then propagate the signal down the ventricular septum to the right and left bundle branches, and then we will reach the apex of the heart and radiate up the walls through the Purkinje fibers. After the T wave, we have ventricular diastole. Ventricular pressure drops below atrial and AV valves open, and then ventricular filling occurs. After the P wave, we have atrial systole, and we finish filling the ventricle. After the QRS complex is complete, we have ventricular systole. The pressure pushes the AV valves closed. At the same time, it opens the semilunar valves, and we eject the blood into the appropriate great vessel. This happens until the ventricle relaxes enough for the arterial pressure in the great valves to be greater than the pressure in the discharging chambers, at which point these one-way valves will slap shut again, and then we start the whole process over. And so this is just showing you again the series of events: the SA node, the AV node, the AV bundle, the right and left branches, and the Purkinje fibers. That's the order of electrical events in the heart. So one of the things that's good for you to do in terms of grasping a lot of the concepts in this chapter is to take a peek at the different muscle types. Remember, skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Compare and contrast how each of them look under a microscope and how they behave biochemically. The heart has external calcium that helps it initiate and maintain its rhythmicity. It also has a plateau that characterizes its contraction profile. It has a prolonged depolarization period that keeps it from going into tetanus, so it will not exhaust itself, and this safeguards us against more frequent heart attacks. Okay, the Frank-Starling law of the heart states that the more you stretch the heart, the more powerfully it will contract. So increased diastolic volume increases the strength of contraction, and this increases the stroke volume. As a result, increased venous return will increase stroke volume. So the more we get blood to come back to the heart, the more the heart will pump blood to the rest of the body. Increased sympathetic activity is in part responsible for this. High pressure in the artery can result in decreased stroke volume, and this slows the opening of the semilunar valve. So this is one of the dangers inherent in hypertension. So how is it that we can increase stroke volume? We can do exercise. Basically, by doing exercise, we increase venous return. As a result, we stretch now those heart chambers more. As they stretch more, they're going to pump with more force, and they'll generate more output, and that will allow blood flow to happen at a greater rate. And so this keeps us healthier for a lot of different reasons. One of them is we deliver nutrients and oxygen more efficiently to the tissues of the body. But in addition to that, it also allows us to remove wastes from body tissues and keep our body tissues metabolically happy. Okay, our heart rate is controlled by autonomic input, nerves that radiate out from the central nervous system and talk to the control centers of the heart. The pacemaker is adjusted by the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata. This is a parasympathetic feed which generates an acetylcholine signal that slows the heart down through the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10. Remember, it's one of those unusual nerves that completely leaves the cervical and cranial region. The sympathetic leads to the heart are usually propagated by norepinephrine at the synapses. Norepinephrine on the heart itself will speed it up. How do we generate sensory input to control this? Well, there are baroreceptors in the aortic arch and the carotid sinus that control blood pressure. Basically, what happens is when the baroreceptors sense an increase in blood pressure, they will act to slow the heart rate, and when they sense a decrease in blood pressure, they will act to speed up the heart rate. There are also chemoreceptors that detect oxygen, carbon dioxide, and the pH of the blood, and it will adjust the heart rate accordingly. Now, how does this work? Well, the greater the amount of oxygen in the blood, the slower the heart rate. And the reason for this is that we are adequately providing oxygen to the tissues of the heart. However, as CO2 accumulates in the blood, what happens is that we're going to speed the heart rate up. And the idea behind this is that we're sending deoxygenated blood to the heart with greater frequency, and as a result, it has a greater chance to unload CO2, to pick up oxygen, and as a result maintain homeostasis. Now, how does pH come into this? Well, basically, the more acidic the blood gets, the greater the heart rate. And the reason for that is that CO2, as it accumulates in the blood, causes the pH to go down because CO2 and water generate carbonic acid inside the plasma and inside the erythrocytes. And so pH decreasing is another way of saying CO2 is increasing. And if we want to get rid of excess CO2, we have to increase the heart rate and, incidentally, increase the respiratory rate. There's other controls on heart rate. Hormones such as epinephrine and norepinephrine increase heart rate. Thyroid hormone stimulates heart rate as well. An increased heart rate is called tachycardia. Tachy means to speed up, cardia means of or pertaining to the heart, so to speed up the heart. There are also ions that can affect heart rate. Increased sodium or potassium decrease increased sodium or potassium can decrease the heart rate and the contraction force. Increased calcium increases the heart rate and the contraction force. What you're looking at here is just a diagram showing you how the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system regulate the heart rate. And to make a long story short, the inputs from the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system via cranial nerve 10 tend to slow heart rate, while the inputs from the thoracocolumnar division, the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, tend to speed the heart rate up. And you can see that diagrammed here, okay? You can see here the cardiovascular center. You can see the vagus nerve feeds slowing down the heart rate, while the sympathetic feeds, here you can see the chain ganglia, the paravertebral chain ganglia, sending leads out to the heart, and these adrenergic neurons will serve to accelerate the heart rate in order to meet increased oxygen demands and oxygen debt. Aerobic exercise strengthens the cardiovascular system. A well-trained athlete can double his maximum cardiac output. Uh, Resting cardiac output is about the same, but resting heart rate can decrease when you exercise. But essentially, what happens when you exercise, a couple things go on. The heart beats more powerfully. Why? Well, as you exercise, you increase venous return to the heart. You increase venous return to the heart, you stretch the heart more, the heart will contract with more force. As the heart contracts with more force, it's more effectively delivering blood to the body with each stroke. The other thing that happens as you exercise is that you generate now greater muscle mass, greater skeletal muscle mass. And as you do that, what happens now is that you provide the blood more detours to get around the body. When that occurs, what happens is that you decrease resistance, i.e. back pressure on the heart, so the heart doesn't have to work as hard to pump more blood around the body. And as a result, blood pressure tends to go down. So that's one of the other hidden benefits of exercise. Now, what follows here are some videos that are going to discuss cardiodynamics, the heart itself, and the conduction system of the heart. So, and I'll also show you guys the video indicating the relationship between EKG and the cardiac cycle, the propagation of the electrical signal through the heart. So stay tuned for that in just a second.
The heart has its own intrinsic regulating system, known as the conduction system. This system generates and distributes electrical impulses over the heart to stimulate the cardiac muscle fibers and cells to contract. The conduction system begins at the sinoatrial node, or SA node, located in the superior wall of the right atria. The SA node sets the pace for the heart rate and is known as the pacemaker. The pace may be affected by the autonomic nervous system, thyroid hormone, and epinephrine. When the impulse is initiated, it spreads through both atria, causing the atria to contract. The impulse then spreads to the atrioventricular node, or AV node. The AV node, located at the juncture of the right atria and ventricle, then relays the impulse to the specialized muscle cells or fibers called the atrioventricular bundle or bundle of His. The atrioventricular bundle distributes the charge over the medial surface of the ventricles to the right and left bundle branches to the Purkinje's fibers. The stimulation of the Purkinje fibers causes the ventricles to contract. The cycle operates as follows. The impulse begins in the SA node, causing the atria to contract. The impulse is relayed to the AV node, atrioventricular bundle, bundle branches, and Purkinje's fibers, causing the ventricles to contract. The heart rests and the cycle begins again, usually 72 to 80 times per minute. This activity can be traced on an EKG. P wave equals atrial contraction. QRS complex equals ventricles contracting. T wave equals the heart at rest.
The heart is a hollow muscular organ, cone-shaped and roughly the size of a fist. It is located in the chest, behind the sternum, and between the lungs. The heart sits slightly off-center. The heart consists of 4 hollow chambers. The 2 upper chambers are called atria, and the 2 lower chambers are the ventricles. The right atrium receives blood from distal parts of the body by way of the superior or inferior vena cava. To keep all the blood flowing in the same direction, the heart has a system of one-way valves. All of the valves consist of leaflets that open and close in response to changing pressures within the chambers. Then blood passes through the tricuspid valve to the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the blood out of the pulmonic valve to the pulmonary artery and on to the lungs for a new supply of oxygen. Oxygenated blood returns via the pulmonary vein to the left atrium, and from the left atrium it passes through the mitral valve and into the left ventricle. When the left ventricle contracts, the oxygenated blood is ejected through the aortic valve to the aorta and distal body tissues. The walls of the left ventricle are 3 times thicker than those of the right side because it takes more pressure to reach distal parts of the body. The septum effectively divides the heart into right and left sides to form 2 separate pumps. The 2 pumps of the right and left heart function in close syncopation. This is a closed system, so the blood continues to pump and flow in a continuous cycle.
The cardiac cycle continues when the atria contract, forcing blood into the relaxed ventricles. Valves prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atria. The cardiac cycle begins when blood fills the atria. The right atrium is filled by veins that carry deoxygenated blood from the body, and the left atrium is filled by the pulmonary veins which carry oxygenated blood from the lungs. The atria are now filled with blood, while the ventricles are relaxed. Some blood flows passively from the atria to the ventricles at this time. The 4 chambers of the heart alternate between contraction and relaxation in a concerted fashion. This pattern is called the cardiac cycle. During the cardiac cycle, the heart chambers beat cyclically to enable a coordinated flow of blood.
Action potentials originate in the sinoatrial node and travel across the wall of the atrium from the sinoatrial node to the atrioventricular node. Action potentials pass slowly through the atrioventricular node to give the atria time to contract. They then pass rapidly along the atrioventricular bundle, which extends from the atrioventricular node through the fibrous skeleton into the interventricular septum. The atrioventricular bundle divides into right and left bundle branches, and action potentials descend rapidly to the apex of each ventricle along the bundle branches. Action potentials are carried by the Purkinje fibers from the bundle branches to the ventricular walls. The rapid conduction from the atrioventricular bundle to the ends of the Purkinje fibers allows the ventricular muscle cells to contract in unison, providing a strong contraction. Ventricular contraction causes the atrioventricular valves to close, which signals the beginning of ventricular systole. The semilunar valves were closed during the previous diastole and remain closed during this period. Continued ventricular contraction increases pressure in the ventricles above the pressure in the aorta and pulmonary trunk, causing the semilunar valves to open. When the ventricles relax and their pressures drop, blood flowing back toward the relaxed ventricles causes the semilunar valves to close, which is the beginning of ventricular diastole. Note that the atrioventricular valves remain closed. When the pressure in the ventricles becomes lower than the pressure in the atrioventricular valves open and blood flows into the relaxed ventricles. This accounts for most of the ventricular filling. The atria then contract and complete the ventricular filling.